Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A simple beginning that would change everything. Morris Watson, a 29-year-old security officer at Silverwind International Airport, stood at the threshold of yet another routine day. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting long, pale beams of light through the expansive glass windows of the airport terminal. As the first few travelers trickled in, the stillness of the early morning was gradually replaced by the hum of activity. Morris smoothed out his crisp blue uniform, adjusting his belt, and set his eyes on the bustling terminal. It was the beginning of another 12-hour shift, filled with the usual challenges and monotonous routines of airport security, keeping watch, ensuring safety, and managing the ebb and flow of hundreds of people. Morris had been working at Silverwind Airport for over 5 years. Over time, the excitement of his job had worn off, replaced by a sense of mechanical efficiency. The faces in the crowd came and went, each one briefly passing through the terminal, their lives intersecting with his for a fleeting moment. There was little time to dwell on the personal stories of the thousands of strangers who passed through. For Morris, his job had become a rhythm, a series of tasks to be completed each day, without much thought or emotional investment. He'd grown used to seeing it all: families saying goodbye, travelers anxiously awaiting their flights, and occasional disruptions that required his attention. But the deeper stories, the ones that lingered in the background, had always remained just out of reach. That was, until today. As Morris made his way through the arrivals hall, the soft click of wheels from rolling suitcases echoed in his ears, the sound blending with the quiet murmur of voices. He glanced at the large departure board where flights flashed in and out, each one representing a small piece of someone's journey. The terminal was gradually filling with people, businessmen hurrying with their briefcases, children tugging at their parents' arms, and the weary faces of travelers who had already been through the fatigue of long flights. Each person, in their own way, carried a story with them, but the crowd remained a sea of faces to Morris, individually unimportant, yet collectively forming the pulse of the airport. But then, his gaze stopped. Sitting alone on one of the benches near the security checkpoint, an elderly man caught Morris's attention. The man was impeccably dressed, his attire seeming out of place amidst the casual travel wear of most passengers. His beige jacket, though a little faded with age, was neatly pressed, and his trousers were impeccably tailored. His face, though marked with the deep lines of time, carried an air of dignity and strength. There was a quiet grace about him, a certain poise, that stood out in sharp contrast to the hurried pace of the airport. What struck Morris even more was the bouquet of red roses the man held delicately in his lap. The flowers were vibrant, though the petals had started to wilt at the edges, as if they'd been carried through many days of waiting. A small travel pillow lay beside him, an indication that the man had been there for a while. His eyes, though tired, seemed to search the faces in the crowd with a mixture of hope and anxiety, a quiet anticipation that made him appear almost out of place in the hustle of the terminal. Morris's curiosity piqued. He had been working at the airport long enough to recognize patterns, and something about this elderly man seemed unusual. It wasn't just the pristine appearance or the bouquet, it was the stillness around him. Everyone else was in motion, rushing to their flights, checking the time, or heading to the nearest coffee stand, but the elderly man remained frozen in his spot, his eyes scanning the crowd as though he was waiting for someone. As Morris made his rounds, the man's presence stayed in his mind. It wasn't that he hadn't seen elderly passengers before, or that he was unaccustomed to seeing people sitting for long periods. But there was something different about this man. His posture, though stooped with age, held an air of quiet dignity. The roses seemed to symbolize something far deeper than just a casual gesture. As if drawn by an invisible force, Morris found himself returning to the man's side, wondering if he needed help or simply a kind word. As he neared the elderly gentleman, the man's gaze shifted and their eyes met. There was a moment of recognition in the man's eyes, as if he had been expecting someone to approach. The elderly man smiled softly, a gesture so full of kindness that it made Morris pause. "Excuse me, young man," the elderly man said, his voice soft but clear. "Could you tell me when Flight 335 will be arriving?" Morris was taken aback. His shift had just begun, and he had yet to check the flight schedules. But there was something about the way the man spoke, so polite, so composed, that it made Morris feel an instant connection. Most travelers were in a hurry, and many of them didn't spare a second glance at the security officers standing nearby. This man, however, was different. His tone was calm, respectful, and there was no urgency in his voice, despite the apparent anticipation in his eyes. "I'm sorry, sir," Morris replied with a warm smile. "As security, I don't have access to the flight schedules, but if you look over there," he gestured toward the large digital display on the far wall, "you can find all the arrival times listed." The elderly man nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Oh, thank you so much," he said, his gratitude sincere. "I'm terribly sorry to have disturbed you. It's just that I'm waiting for someone very special, and I wouldn't want to miss her arrival for the world." The way the man spoke, with such genuine excitement, struck something in Morris's chest. There was a depth to the man's words, an undercurrent of emotion that made him realize this was not just a casual encounter. This elderly man had a purpose here, a reason for waiting that went beyond the usual passing traveler. "No problem at all, sir," Morris said, trying to mask the growing curiosity in his voice. "I hope she arrives soon. Good luck with everything." As he walked away, his thoughts lingered on the elderly man. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he had yet uncovered. The man's quiet determination, his apparent patience, it all seemed to hold a deeper significance. The fact that he had been sitting there for what could only be described as days, clutching a bouquet of roses as if they held some hidden meaning, made Morris feel a tug of something deep inside him, a curiosity, but also a sense of admiration for this mysterious figure. As the day went on, Morris continued with his duties, but his mind kept returning to the elderly man. The curiosity gnawed at him. Who was he waiting for? And why had he been sitting there for so long, not even attempting to board a flight himself? Little did Morris know, this simple encounter was the beginning of a chain of events that would not only uncover the elderly man's extraordinary story, but would change the course of his own life forever. The next few days at the airport would test his resolve, challenge his understanding of human connection, and reveal a story so powerful that it would leave an indelible mark on everyone who crossed paths with it. And the elderly man, with his roses and quiet dignity, would be at the center of it all. The waiting game. The following morning, as dawn broke over Silverwind International Airport, the usual rhythm of the terminal began to stir once more. The quiet hum of the early morning crowd filled the air, and the soft rattle of suitcase wheels echoed through the vast, open space. But for Morris Watson, this morning felt different. As the sun slowly climbed higher, casting a golden glow through the high windows, his thoughts were preoccupied with the elderly man he had encountered the previous day. The encounter, though brief, had left a lasting impression. Morris couldn't stop wondering about the old man. The roses. The anxious yet hopeful expression on his face. His polite but urgent manner of speaking. All of it had created an impression that lingered far longer than it should have for a simple encounter with a stranger. What struck him the most was the sense of purpose the man had, despite sitting for hours in the same spot. He wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He was waiting. For something. Or someone. With a sense of curiosity nagging at him, Morris started his shift, glancing around the airport as he checked security cameras and made his rounds through the terminal. His routine was the same as always, yet it felt heavier this morning. As he passed through the arrivals hall, he found himself glancing toward the bench where the elderly man had been sitting. To his surprise, the man was there again, still wearing the same beige jacket and still holding the bouquet of wilting roses. Morris paused, watching him for a moment. The elderly man's posture was the same, though there was something about him now that seemed even more fragile, more worn. The tiredness in his eyes had deepened overnight. Yet, his gaze remained steady, scanning the crowd with an almost obsessive focus. It was as though he was searching for someone among the sea of faces that passed by. The sight tugged at something inside Morris. He had seen many passengers in the airport over the years, each with their own stories, but this man was different. There was a quiet intensity in the way he waited, as if he knew exactly who he was waiting for and that nothing else mattered in the world until she arrived. Morris continued his rounds, but found his thoughts drawn back to the old man again and again. He couldn't understand it. Why would anyone wait so long for someone, especially in an airport, where time seemed to slip away so quickly, where people came and went, lost in the endless cycle of arrivals and departures? It didn't make sense. Around midday, Morris took his usual break, retreating to the staff lounge to grab a cup of coffee. The room was quiet, and he sat by the window, looking out at the bustling airport. But his mind wasn't on the work or the usual small talk from his colleagues, it was on the elderly man. He found himself wondering how long the man had been waiting there, how many hours or days he had spent watching the crowds, hoping for a glimpse of the person he was waiting for. Why hadn't he tried to find a place to rest, maybe in a more comfortable part of the airport? Why sit there, day after day, as if he had all the time in the world? Unable to resist, Morris decided to approach the man again. He stood up from his seat, his coffee cup forgotten, and walked down the long corridor toward the arrivals hall. As he neared the spot where the elderly man sat, he took a deep breath. There was something almost sacred in the air around the old man. He seemed to exist in his own world, apart from the rushing chaos of the airport. Morris felt an overwhelming desire to speak to him once again, to understand what was behind his endless waiting. As he drew closer, the elderly man's eyes met his again. This time, there was no hint of surprise or hesitation in the old man's gaze, just the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had been waiting patiently, perhaps for someone like Morris to finally take notice. Morris stopped in front of him. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but, are you okay? You've been here for a few days now, and I can't help but wonder if you need anything." The old man's face softened, and he gave a gentle smile, though there was a sadness behind his eyes that hadn't been there the day before. "Oh, I'm fine, young man," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm just waiting for someone very special." Morris hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I see. But, if you don't mind me asking, who are you waiting for? It's not like you to wait here for so long without anyone around." The elderly man's eyes twinkled briefly with a glimmer of something unreadable. "I've been waiting for her for a long time," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's been years since I last saw her, and I promised I would wait for her at this airport, no matter how long it took. I made a promise, you see." Morris was taken aback. There was something deeply emotional in the man's voice, something that carried a weight of history, a story too powerful to ignore. He hadn't expected such a response. It was clear the old man wasn't just waiting for any ordinary person. He was waiting for. And that nothing else mattered in the world until she arrived. Morris continued his rounds, but found his thoughts drawn back to the old man again and again. He couldn't understand it. Why would anyone wait so long for someone, especially in an airport, where time seemed to slip away so quickly, where people came and went, lost in the endless cycle of arrivals and departures? It didn't make sense. Around midday, Morris took his usual break, retreating to the staff lounge to grab a cup of coffee. The room was quiet, and he sat by the window, looking out at the bustling airport. But his mind wasn't on the work or the usual small talk from his colleagues, it was on the elderly man. He found himself wondering how long the man had been waiting there, how many hours or days he had spent watching the crowds, hoping for a glimpse of the person he was waiting for. Why hadn't he tried to find a place to rest, maybe in a more comfortable part of the airport? Why sit there, day after day, as if he had all the time in the world? Unable to resist, Morris decided to approach the man again. He stood up from his seat, his coffee cup forgotten, and walked down the long corridor toward the arrivals hall. As he neared the spot where the elderly man sat, he took a deep breath. There was something almost sacred in the air around the old man. He seemed to exist in his own world, apart from the rushing chaos of the airport. Morris felt an overwhelming desire to speak to him once again, to understand what was behind his endless waiting. As he drew closer, the elderly man's eyes met his again. This time, there was no hint of surprise or hesitation in the old man's gaze, just the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had been waiting patiently, perhaps for someone like Morris to finally take notice. Morris stopped in front of him. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but, are you okay? You've been here for a few days now, and I can't help but wonder if you need anything." The old man's face softened, and he gave a gentle smile, though there was a sadness behind his eyes that hadn't been there the day before. "Oh, I'm fine, young man," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm just waiting for someone very special." Morris hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I see. But, if you don't mind me asking, who are you waiting for? It's not like you to wait here for so long without anyone around." The elderly man's eyes twinkled briefly, with a glimmer of something unreadable. "I've been waiting for her for a long time," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's been years since I last saw her, and I promised I would wait for her at this airport, no matter how long it took. I made a promise, you see." Morris was taken aback. There was something deeply emotional in the man's voice, something that carried a weight of history, a story too powerful to ignore. He hadn't expected such a response. It was clear the old man wasn't just waiting for any ordinary person. He was waiting for someone significant, someone whose return meant everything to him. "Who is she?" Morris asked softly, his curiosity now overwhelming any reservations. The elderly man paused, his gaze shifting toward the large windows of the terminal, as though searching for her amidst the crowd. "She was my wife," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "We were supposed to be together forever. We made plans, dreams. But life, it had other plans for us. She had to leave unexpectedly. I've waited here every year since then, hoping she would come back to me." Morris's heart clenched at the man's words. The weight of his sorrow, his undying love and devotion, was evident in his trembling hands as they gently held the bouquet of roses. The flowers had started to wilt, but the sentiment they represented hadn't faded, not in the man's heart, at least. Morris felt a deep surge of empathy for this elderly man who, despite time and distance, was still holding on to a love that had transcended physical presence. The love was alive in his heart, undiminished by the years. "How long has it been?" Morris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "It's been 35 years, he said, the pain in his voice unmistakable. 35 years since I last saw her. We were supposed to meet here, in this very spot. We promised we would. She was supposed to return. And I've been here ever since, waiting, just as we agreed. I haven't been able to leave, not until I see her again." Morris stood in stunned silence, unable to find the right words. What could he possibly say to someone who had devoted their entire life to waiting for a promise that never came to fruition? What could he say to a man who had endured 35 years of hope, of waiting, in the same place, holding on to the memory of a lost love? Before he could speak, the elderly man turned his gaze back toward the terminal. His eyes flickered with a renewed spark of anticipation. "She should be here soon," he murmured, as if to himself. She promised. She would never break her promise. Morris watched him closely. There was no doubt in the elderly man's voice, no hint of uncertainty. He truly believed she would return. But as Morris stood there, watching the old man's hopeful gaze, a sinking feeling began to grow in his chest. He had no idea what this story would ultimately lead to, but one thing was clear, this elderly man was not just waiting for a woman to appear from a plane. He was waiting for something far deeper, something that could never be easily explained. The promise, the devotion, the sheer unwavering belief in her return, it all seemed almost too much for the airport to contain. And yet, the more Morris listened, the more he realized that he was witnessing a story that had been unfolding for years, perhaps even decades. There was more to this story than he could have ever imagined. And now, Morris was part of it. The man's waiting had begun to change something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. A renewed sense of hope, a belief in something greater, something that transcended time and logic. This was not just a waiting game. It was a life story, one that was about to unfold in ways that no one at Silverwind Airport could ever have anticipated. The revelation. As the days went by, Morris couldn't stop thinking about the elderly man. His story, though simple in words, carried a profound weight that began to affect Morris on a deeper level. His usual routine at Silverwind Airport was now tinted with a quiet sadness, the image of the old man's unwavering hope a shadow that followed him throughout his shifts. It wasn't just the man's story that lingered in his mind, but the sheer magnitude of devotion and patience he had shown. 35 years. 35 years of waiting, of holding on to a promise made in a different time, a different era. Every time Morris walked past the arrivals area, he saw him there, sitting alone with his bouquet of roses, staring out at the busy crowd with the same hopeful, yet weary eyes. There were no signs of him leaving, no indication that he had given up. He had become a fixture of the airport, almost as if the place itself had become entwined with his own waiting, a part of his ritual. It was hard to imagine that such a man had ever left the airport, and yet Morris knew he must have. There must have been a time when the elderly man had left to go home, to live his life. But that life, whatever it had been, was now buried in the past, and only this singular, stubborn act of waiting remained. Morris had learned some things about the elderly man from his colleagues over the past few days. The man's name was Charles Thompson, and he had been a regular at Silverwind for years, though no one had ever really paid attention to him until recently. Charles had been married to a woman named Eleanor, a woman whose beauty and spirit were described in glowing terms by those who remembered her. Their love story, it seemed, had been one for the ages, a whirlwind romance that had begun in their youth and blossomed into a deep, enduring bond. But tragedy had struck when Eleanor, the love of Charles's life, had passed away unexpectedly. The cause had never been clear to most, but the result was undeniable: Charles had never fully recovered from the loss. It was said that Eleanor had promised to return to him someday. That was why Charles had waited, why he had returned year after year to Silverwind Airport. She had promised him that they would meet again, at the same place where they had once parted, and they would begin a new chapter of their lives. No matter how much time passed, no matter how many people came and went, Charles was convinced that she would return to him. He had never stopped believing in that promise, and it was that belief that kept him rooted in place, waiting. Morris's fascination with Charles's story turned into something much more personal. He couldn't explain it, but he found himself feeling a connection to the old man that went beyond just curiosity. There was something about the quiet desperation in his eyes, the palpable love he held for a woman who had long since left this world, that stirred something inside him. It reminded him of the people he had lost, his own mother, his grandmother, even old friends who had drifted out of his life. Time, it seemed, had a way of stealing people from you, and the loss was something no one could truly prepare for. One evening, as the terminal was starting to quiet down and the lights of the airport began to flicker on, Morris found himself walking down the same corridor toward the arrivals hall. The old man was there again, as usual. This time, however, there was a strange aura about him. He seemed more alert, more aware of his surroundings. His eyes, which had previously been focused on the crowd with a kind of distant hope, now seemed to scan every face that passed by with an intensity that was almost alarming. "Sir," Morris said gently as he approached, "I just wanted to check on you again. Is everything okay?" The elderly man looked up at him, his face softening as he recognized him. "Ah, young man," Charles replied, his voice a little shaky. "I've been waiting for so long, but something feels different today. I can feel it in my bones. She's coming. I know it. She promised she would return, and I believe her. I believe in her more than anything else in this world." Morris stood still, unsure of what to say. There was no mistaking the certainty in Charles's voice. For all the years he had spent in this airport, for all the days and nights he had waited for someone who had never appeared, there was an unshakable belief in him. Charles wasn't just waiting for a loved one, he was holding on to something far more profound, the belief in promises, in love, and in the impossible. Morris had never seen anything quite like it. "Do you think she's coming today?" Morris asked, his curiosity piqued. Charles nodded without hesitation. "I can feel it. The air is different today. I can sense her presence. I've been patient for all these years, but today, I can feel it in my heart. She's coming." Morris stood in silence for a moment, watching Charles as he spoke. There was no question in his mind that the man truly believed every word he said. The depth of his conviction was staggering, and it made Morris think about the promises he had made in his own life, promises he had let slip away, dreams he had once held on to but had allowed to fade into the background of his busy, everyday existence. As Morris prepared to walk away, he turned one last time to the elderly man. "I hope she does, sir. I really do." Charles smiled softly, the lines of his face softening. "Thank you, young man. I know she will. I just have to be here, in case she arrives." Morris nodded and walked away, but the moment stayed with him, gnawing at his thoughts. How could he leave the old man to wait indefinitely, holding on to a belief that could never be realized? Was it possible that someone could be so convinced of a reunion that they could withstand the pain of waiting for decades without ever faltering? As the night wore on, a sense of urgency began to build in the back of Morris's mind. He had heard many things in his time working at the airport, from tearful goodbyes to joyful reunions, but this felt different. There was something in the air, a strange tension that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface. Morris knew he had to act, but how? Hours passed, and Charles continued to sit there, clutching his bouquet of roses, with an unyielding grip. His gaze was steady, scanning the crowd as if he knew, without a doubt, that the person he had waited for so long would appear at any moment. Morris returned to his post, the thought of Charles still hanging heavy in his mind. But the longer he watched the elderly man, the more the weight of his devotion felt like a silent call. This man's love, his belief, his waiting, was it all in vain? Or was there something deeper that could be unlocked from this extraordinary act of patience? In that moment, something in Morris's heart shifted. He realized that it wasn't just about whether Eleanor would return or not. It was about the enduring power of love, the kind of love that could keep a person anchored, no matter how much time passed. Morris understood now that love was not just a feeling, it was a force that transcended time, a force that could defy the limitations of the physical world. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was something miraculous about Charles's waiting. Maybe his story wasn't about waiting for someone who had passed. It was about the ability to believe, to hope, to never give up, even when the world around you told you to move on. As Morris looked toward the elderly man once more, he couldn't help but wonder if the true miracle of this story wasn't in the reunion Charles awaited, but in the belief that no matter what, love could never truly be lost. The unseen miracle. The days passed like a slow, steady march, each blending into the next with the same rhythm as the airport's ceaseless activity. Yet, for Maurice, everything had changed. The simple task of walking through the terminal had taken on a new significance, each glance toward the elderly man, Charles, a reminder of what it meant to hold on to something, to wait patiently for a promise to be fulfilled. The urgency that had been growing inside him intensified, but he still didn't know how to help the man. It wasn't just about offering comfort anymore, it was about understanding the essence of hope and how powerful it could be. Charles continued to sit there, day after day, the roses never quite wilting, his hands always clasped around them as if they were the very lifeline that kept him grounded. The staff at Silverwind had begun to notice the man more as well, but they, like Maurice, didn't know how to approach the subject. They could only watch as this frail, elderly man, in the quietest way, held the airport in a gentle grip of unspoken devotion. One morning, as the first soft light of dawn began to flood the terminal, Maurice once again walked past Charles's usual bench. This time, however, something was different. Charles was still there, but his eyes were no longer scanning the crowd in search of a familiar face. Instead, they were closed, his weathered features at rest in a state of deep concentration. His hand still cradled the bouquet of roses, but there was a calmness to his presence that Maurice hadn't seen before. It was as though Charles had settled into the waiting itself, no longer restless, no longer anxious, but simply at peace with the act of waiting, with the love he had carried for so long. Maurice couldn't help but approach. He stopped in front of the old man, his heart stirring with a sense of reverence. "Sir," he said softly, his voice tentative, "are you okay?" Charles slowly opened his eyes and, for the first time in days, a smile spread across his face, gentle, but radiant. "I'm fine, young man," he replied, his voice calm, almost otherworldly. "I've been waiting for a long time, but I've come to understand something important. It's not about the moment she arrives. It's about the love I carry for her, the love we shared. That love will never fade, no matter where she is. I'm not waiting for a reunion anymore. I'm just holding on to the memory of everything we built together." Maurice's chest tightened, and a lump formed in his throat. There was something profoundly beautiful about Charles's words, something that transcended the physical boundaries of space and time. The love he had shared with Eleanor, though bound to a moment in history, had become a living, breathing part of him, something that couldn't be erased, even in death. "I think you've taught me something, sir," Maurice said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so much of my life thinking about what I've lost. I never realized how much I could hold on to the things that truly matter, the people I've loved, the moments that changed me. You've shown me that love doesn't end, even when people do." Charles's smile deepened, and for a moment, it was as if the entire airport faded into the background. The bustling crowds, the constant announcements over the loudspeakers, the endless movement of travelers, all of it seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them standing in that sacred space of understanding. "You're beginning to understand, Maurice," Charles said, his voice like a soft melody. "Love doesn't require a return. It exists because it's real, because it's shared. We don't wait to be loved in return. We wait because we have something worth waiting for, even if that something is just the memory of it. Eleanor's promise was never about her return to me, it was about the love we gave each other, and that's something that time can never take away." The words settled into Maurice's heart, and for the first time, he felt a sense of calm that had eluded him for years. The anger, the frustration, the guilt of things left unsaid with his own family, they all seemed trivial now, unimportant in the face of this overwhelming truth. He realized he had been so focused on the idea of needing a resolution, of waiting for closure, that he had missed the point entirely. There was no closure to be had, only the ongoing journey of carrying forward the love and lessons from the past. Charles's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, and then, without another word, he closed his eyes again, sinking into the peace he had found. Maurice stood there for several minutes, unsure of what to do next. He had come seeking answers for Charles, but it was Charles who had given him the answer he had been searching for his entire life. The airport felt different that day. The lights seemed softer, the sounds quieter, as though the very air had been charged with an unseen energy. Maurice could feel it in his bones, a new understanding blossoming within him. He walked through the terminal, his heart open and raw, like a man who had just come into the knowledge of a great secret. It wasn't long before word spread through the airport about Charles and his unwavering dedication. The staff and the passengers began to look at him with a new sense of admiration, not as the frail old man sitting in the corner, waiting for a lost promise, but as someone who embodied the greatest lesson of all, love's capacity to endure, no matter the circumstances. Maurice, too, had changed. He found himself engaging more deeply with the people around him, taking time to appreciate the fleeting moments, the small gestures of kindness, and the connections that made life meaningful. He realized that love wasn't just something you felt for others, it was something that bound you to everything, from the fleeting encounters with strangers to the unspoken bonds that tied you to your past. Weeks went by, and Charles continued his quiet vigil at the airport, though now, something had shifted. The anxious edge in his eyes had softened, replaced by a peaceful acceptance that transcended his waiting. He had let go of the need for a grand reunion. The love he held was enough. It always had been. And then, one morning, something incredible happened. As Maurice walked toward the arrivals hall, he spotted Charles standing near the same bench where he had spent so many hours. But this time, there was someone standing next to him, an older woman, with graying hair and a gentle smile. She looked just like Eleanor, only aged with time, her presence quiet but undeniable. For a moment, Maurice stood frozen, unsure if he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. The woman turned toward him, and in her eyes, he saw the same deep, timeless love that had radiated from Charles all these years. She stepped forward, and with a voice that carried the weight of years and memories, she spoke. "Thank you for looking after him," she said softly. "He never stopped waiting. And neither did I." It was an impossible reunion, one that defied all logic, yet there it was. In the quietest of moments, at the most unexpected of times, love had found its way back. Maurice's heart swelled with emotion as he watched the two of them embrace, their reunion filled with a joy that seemed to erase the years between them. As they held each other, Charles whispered into Eleanor's ear, "I knew you'd come back." And for the first time in so long, Maurice truly believed in the power of love. The kind of love that transcends time, that defies all odds, and that lives on even when the world says it should have ended. He had witnessed the impossible, and in doing so, he had discovered that miracles were not always grand, not always visible to the eye. Sometimes, they were as simple as the quiet, patient act of waiting for something that might never come, and in the waiting, discovering that the love you held all along was the real miracle. The reunion was as miraculous as it was unexpected, but it wasn't the only miracle that day. The true miracle was the transformation that had occurred within Maurice himself, the understanding that love doesn't fade. It doesn't die. It lives, in the spaces between moments, in the waiting, and in the remembering. And in that moment, Maurice had finally found his own peace, as Charles had so many years before.